The room sounds cheap: fluorescent lights, cooling fans, paper sliding across the government desk. On one side of the glass, a bidder studies a map of the United States broken into invisible territories. Nothing outside has changed. The rooftops are still there. The summer sky over Washington looks exactly as it did yesterday. But on the terminal, a price is climbing for permission to transmit through a slice of that empty-looking air. The bidder knows the number. What he cannot see is the argument already hidden inside it. This license may help build a communications network, shut out a rival, strand an investment, or become worth far more than anyone in the room expects. The audience knows something the map cannot show him yet. Those colored blocks will become billion-dollar assets, even though the winner will not own one cloud, one radio wave, or 1 inch of atmosphere. In July 1994, the United States begins turning interference protection into a market. So what is a spectrum auction actually selling? And how did permission to use something nobody can possess become some of the most valuable real estate on Earth?
Welcome to From Smoke to Signal. I'm Mo, and my co-host Smart Cat will take you on a journey where every signal has a story. Let's begin.
Let's clear up the first misconception before it charges us interest. A spectrum auction does not sell a frequency the way a county sells a parcel of land. The winning bidder receives a license, a defined authorization to operate under specified frequencies, geography, technical limits, service rules, deadlines, and a limited term. That authorization can carry renewal expectations and secondary market value, but it remains subject to federal law and FCC control. The atmosphere never changes hands. What becomes scarce is coordinated access, the ability to build transmitters and receivers with a reasonable expectation that the licensee's authorized operations will receive protection from incompatible use. That expectation can support towers, handsets, chips, financing, coverage plans, and years of construction. The paper is valuable because an entire network can be organized around the interference environment it describes.
So the government keeps the sky, the winner gets the house rules, and the invoice still has enough zeros to frighten my calculator.
Exactly, and those zeros do not attach evenly to every megahertz. Lower frequency mobile bands can cover larger areas and generally reach into buildings more effectively than much higher bands. Mid-band holdings can offer a valuable compromise, meaningful coverage with enough bandwidth for heavy broadband demand. Higher bands can deliver enormous capacity where links are shorter, cells are denser, or antennas are more directional. Geography changes the calculation again. A block covering a major population center does not face the same demand as an otherwise similar block over sparsely populated territory. Then add incumbent users, paired or unpaired structure, equipment availability, international borders, build-out requirements, and adjacent band conditions. The auction is pricing a technical ecosystem disguised as a row on a bidding screen. Before competitive bidding, the FCC assigned some mutually exclusive licenses through comparative hearings and later lotteries. A comparative hearing asked the agency to judge applicants against public interest criteria. That could mean years of filings, testimony, appeals, and expensive advocacy before anyone built the proposed system. Lotteries were faster in one sense, but a random draw could reward an applicant that valued the license less than companies prepared to deploy immediately. It also encouraged applications from parties hoping to win an authorization they might later transfer. Neither method made allocation politics disappear. Both simply chose winners without asking all qualified applicants to reveal value through bids. By the early 1990s, Congress was ready to try a controlled market inside the regulatory system. The shift also changed what an applicant had to prove. A hearing rewarded the strongest administrative case. A lottery rewarded a valid application and luck. Competitive bidding demanded capital valuation discipline and the nerve to stop when a desired license crossed the company's limit. The new selection method moved part of the contest from lawyers' filings into finance teams' models. Congress gave the FCC authority in 1993 to use competitive bidding for certain licenses when mutually exclusive applications were accepted. The Commission began auctioning licenses in 1994. That legal change did not announce that revenue was the only goal. Auction authority sits beside statutory objectives involving efficient and intensive spectrum use, rapid deployment, competition, economic opportunity, and recovery for the public of a portion of the value created by access to this resource. Those objectives can pull in different directions. A design that maximizes receipts may not maximize participation by smaller firms. A rule that accelerates clearing may impose heavy costs on incumbents. From its first bid, the auction program was never merely a cash register. It was communications policy with a price clock attached. The people asked to design this system faced a problem that ordinary auctions do not. A painting can be sold one at a time, a radio network cannot. A carrier may need several neighboring geographic licenses to create a useful footprint. It may need two frequency blocks that work together. Winning half of that package can be worse than winning nothing because the stranded pieces do not deliver the planned network. Economists call those relationships complementarities. FCC staff and outside auction theorists, including economists associated with the design of early simultaneous auctions, had to build a process where prices across many related licenses could develop together. Paul Milgram, Robert Wilson, Preston McAfee, and other contributors became linked to that design history, but the mechanism emerged through an unusual collaboration among theory, agency requirements, software, law, and RF realities. The theorist could describe incentives. The engineer could explain why two licenses that looked similar on paper behave differently at a border or inside a handset plan. Agency lawyers had to turn both answers into enforceable procedures. Software teams then had to make hundreds of strategic decisions, arrive, validate, and update without losing the auction's integrity. A failure in any one discipline could distort every price on the screen.
Winning half a network sounds like winning one shoe. Technically a victory, operationally a very expensive limp.
The simultaneous multiple round format gave bidders repeated chances to respond as prices rose across a group of licenses. Instead of sealing one bid and learning the result after every alternative had vanished, participants could watch relative prices and redirect demand from one area or block to another. Activity rules discouraged them from sitting out early rounds and jumping in only at the end. Minimum bid increments kept movement orderly. Eligibility and payment rules tried to separate serious demand from theater. None of that made strategy simple. Every round exposed information to competitors. A bidder shifting away from one market could change prices somewhere else. A company assembling a national or regional footprint had to protect its plan without revealing more than the rules required. That tension created an exposure risk. The bidder might lead on several pieces, lose the one piece that made them valuable together, and remain committed to the rest. Price discovery helped, but it also gave opponents time to infer where a rival could not walk away. The terminal was part marketplace, part poker table, with federal rules controlling which gestures counted. The first sale in July 1994 involved narrowband personal communication service licenses. The amounts were modest compared with auctions that followed, but the institutional gamble worked well enough to continue. Bidders submitted prices, licenses moved toward parties that signaled strong economic value. The FCC could observe how participants behaved and revise later procedures. Soon, spectrum auctions were producing sums that made the phrase "selling the sky" feel less like metaphor and more like a budget line. Yet the agency still was not handing over blank frequencies. Winners inherited construction obligations, technical restrictions, service conditions, and the commercial risk that consumer demand or equipment plans might fail. The gavel did not build a single base station. Put yourself on the winner's side of the table. The license payment is only the opening expense. Engineers must turn propagation models into sites. Real estate teams need leases. Communities review structures. Equipment has to exist for the band. Handsets need compatible radios. Backhaul, power, maintenance, security, and customer support arrive long before the network earns back its first auction dollar. If the license covers difficult terrain or carries a demanding build-out deadline, the business plan tightens. If neighboring spectrum is noisy, filters and coordination may become more complicated. If the company paid too much because a rival kept bidding, every later construction decision starts under that weight. The bidder may win the air rights and still lose the business.
The auction receipt is the short one. The tower, handset, backhaul, power, maintenance, and customer complaints are apparently sold separately.
Now move to the smaller applicants table. Deep-pocketed incumbents can spread risk across existing customers, infrastructure, and spectrum portfolios. A new entrant may be betting the company on one band and one financing package. Auction policy has used tools such as bidding credits and designated entity provisions to expand opportunity for qualifying smaller businesses. Those policies have also attracted scrutiny when arrangements appeared to give well-capitalized partners indirect benefit from preferences intended for independent entrants. The human stake is not abstract fairness. It is whether a rural operator, regional provider, tribal applicant, or a new competitor can obtain usable spectrum and actually survive long enough to deploy it. The rule book has to distinguish support from disguise while billions of dollars are waiting on the other side of the definition. Financing can disappear between a winning bid and the payment deadline. Equipment partners can change course. A business plan built around one price can fail when repeated rounds push the license higher. For a small bidder, the last click is not a triumphant movie ending. It may be the moment every investor asks whether the company still has enough money left to operate. Auctions become even more personal when the band is not empty. A television broadcaster may hold an authorization tied to an audience, a tower, employees, and decades of local identity. A satellite operator may serve customers through earth stations built for a particular frequency plan. Public safety and federal systems can carry missions that cannot simply pause while a new bidder arrives. Clearing spectrum sounds clean only from a distance. Up close, it means retuning equipment, moving channels, protecting service, reimbursing costs, negotiating schedules, and deciding which risks are acceptable. The auction designer works with colored blocks. The incumbent engineer works with hardware that has to function on Monday morning. Here is the object being valued. Imagine a box with more than 3 dimensions. One edge is frequency, the authorized band or channel. Another is geography, nationwide, regional, local, or some other service area. Add time because licenses have terms and deadlines. Add power, antenna characteristics, emission limits, and protection criteria. Add the service and eligibility rules. Then place that box next to every adjacent license, incumbent assignment, border agreement, and unlicensed device that can affect it. That whole package, not a naked megahertz, is what a bidder studies. 2 authorizations with equal bandwidth can have radically different worth because one supports a mature equipment ecosystem and clean deployment path, while the other arrives with difficult neighbors or uncertain clearing. Paired spectrum may support separate uplink and downlink paths in an established device architecture. Unpaired spectrum may suit time division systems or other deployments but require a different ecosystem. Contiguous blocks can enable wider channels with less internal fragmentation. A portfolio scattered across slivers can carry plenty of total bandwidth and still frustrate the radio designers asked to combine it. Frequency changes the economics through physics. Lower bands often offer broad coverage and stronger building penetration, reducing the number of sites needed for a basic footprint. They may also provide narrower blocks or face-heavy incumbent use. Mid-band spectrum has become prized for mobile broadband because it can balance coverage with substantial channel bandwidth. Millimeter wave bands can support very wide channels, but useful coverage may require dense infrastructure and clear path conditions. Antenna design changes with wavelength. Propagation changes with terrain, foliage, walls, rain, and clutter. There is no universal price per megahertz because a megahertz at 700 megahertz is not an interchangeable copy of one at 28 GHz. The same numerical width can demand a completely different network.
Same number of megahertz, different job, different map, different tower bill. Spectrum math has a personality problem.
Interference makes the boundary valuable. A transmitter does not produce a perfectly vertical wall at the edge of its assigned band. Real emissions fall off according to equipment performance and regulatory masks. A receiver does not become deaf 1 Hz outside its desired channel. Its selectivity, dynamic range, antenna, and filtering determine what nearby energy can do. Regulators therefore write power limits, out-of-band emission requirements, separation rules, coordination procedures, and sometimes guard bands. Those protections consume engineering effort and occasionally spectrum that cannot carry the highest value service. A license with predictable neighbors supports investment. A license beside unresolved compatibility fights may trade at a discount no marketing slogan can erase. The bidder therefore reads more than the auction notice. Engineers examine proposed service rules, incumbent records, filter assumptions, antenna heights, deployment densities, and the receivers operating next door. A single unresolved compatibility condition can change equipment cost across thousands of sites. The price clock may display dollars, but the hidden unit beneath it is coexistence risk. Geography is not only a market boundary. Radio energy crosses county lines, license borders, and national frontiers without checking the auction database. A carrier deploying near Canada or Mexico may operate under coordination limits shaped by international agreements. Two domestic licensees sharing an edge must manage base stations and user devices whose signals do not stop at the color boundary on a map. Terrain can help in one place and expose interference paths in another. Coastal ducting, high sites, and unusual propagation can carry energy beyond the footprint planners expected. The winning bid buys authorization, not immunity from Maxwell's equations. Because business plans change, licenses can move through regulated secondary markets. Subject to FCC rules, parties may seek approval for assignments, transfers of control, leases, partitioning of geographic areas, or disaggregation of spectrum. These tools let a company reshape a portfolio without waiting for the government to auction the band again. They can also move underused rights toward an operator prepared to deploy, but the transaction remains attached to the authorization. Technical conditions, eligibility rules, service obligations, and commission oversight do not evaporate when money changes hands. This is property-like behavior inside an administrative license, not a private deed that can order the public regulator off the lawn. Partitioning can separate territory. Disaggregation can separate frequencies. A lease can provide operational access without transferring every element of control. Each option changes who is responsible for compliance and how the spectrum appears in the commission's records. The secondary market works only if the legal transaction and the RF operation describe the same reality. Exclusive licensing is only one way to organize access. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth create enormous economic value in unlicensed bands where users accept power limits, equipment rules, and no individual right to interference protection from compliant neighbors. Shared access frameworks can add priority tiers, databases, sensing, or coordination procedures so multiple classes of user occupy the same band under different protections. Those models do not make auctions obsolete. They reveal the choice beneath every allocation, which uses need exclusivity, which can tolerate contention, and which can share if a coordination system knows who is operating where. Sometimes the most valuable decision is to auction a license. Sometimes it is to leave the band open enough for millions of devices. Nobody at the FCC could have selected in advance. Exclusive rights can support high power, wide area systems that need predictable quality. Unlicensed rules can unleash low-cost innovation because a manufacturer does not have to win a nationwide auction before selling a device. Database coordination can protect higher priority operations while admitting others when and where conditions allow. The choice of access model is itself an allocation of risk. The breakthrough was not government discovers money. It was the construction of a repeatable assignment mechanism for scarce, mutually exclusive authorizations. Competitive bidding could sort among qualified applicants using willingness to pay, while the FCC retained authority over the band plan, license terms, bidder qualifications, technical rules, and post-auction obligations. The method also generated information. Prices revealed where bidders saw stronger combinations of coverage, bandwidth, and market opportunity. Failed packages exposed design problems. Defaults exposed financing risk. Participation patterns tested whether eligibility rules were working. The auction became both an assignment process and a diagnostic instrument for the market the commission had designed.
One screen measures what companies say the license is worth. The tower later measures whether they were right. That feels dangerously close to accountability.
Watch the bidder's face before you look at the map. The round closes. His eyes move once across the number, then stop. He has just committed real money to something nobody in the room can touch, then look past him. The paper map dissolves into a continental grid of license areas. Towers rise, coverage spreads along highways and through cities. Millions of future handsets blink on, each one depending on the interference rights represented by that final figure. The invisible has not become physical property. It has become financeable infrastructure. The auction price was never attached to empty air. It is attached to the network a company believes protected access will let it build. Billions are not buying the heavens. They are buying enough certainty to engineer beneath them. Simultaneous bidding addressed the network builder's fear of being trapped with the wrong fragment. Related licenses remained available across rounds, so bidders could compare changing prices and move towards substitutes. That flexibility did not eliminate the exposure problem. Every move still taught rivals something, nor did it solve every package risk, which is why later, auction designs explored combinatorial or clock-based features for particular sales. But the early format matched the basic shape of wireless demand far better than isolated one-shot sales. It let a bidder ask, round after round, whether this city, that neighboring market, and this frequency block still formed a network worth the combined price. Auction rules also evolved in response to bidder behavior. Information disclosure, withdrawal provisions, activity waivers, and anti-collusion restrictions were not decorative legal language. Each could change strategy. Designers were effectively tuning a machine whose moving parts were companies trying to anticipate one another. Every revision risked creating a new signal that sophisticated bidders could exploit. Auctions also became part of larger band transitions. The 700 MHz process connected mobile licensing with spectrum made available through the digital television transition. AWS auctions paired new commercial opportunities with relocation or protection questions for existing operations. The 600 MHz broadcast incentive auction went further. Television stations could volunteer to relinquish spectrum rights in a reverse auction. Wireless bidders competed for reorganized licenses in a forward auction, and remaining broadcasters had to be repacked into a smaller television band. The sale could not succeed unless economics, channel assignment, interference protection, and physical retuning fit together. That is not a simple gavel. It is a national engineering move with bids inside it. The reverse side had to discover what compensation broadcasters would accept for relinquishing rights. The forward side had to discover what wireless bidders would pay for the cleared spectrum. Between them sat a repacking problem. Fit continuing television stations into fewer channels without causing prohibited interference. If the arithmetic bids and channel plan did not meet, the clearing target had to change. Later C-band repurposing made the same truth impossible to miss. The band already supported satellite services and Earth stations. Making part of it available for terrestrial 5G required clearing deadlines, relocation work, equipment changes, protection of continuing operations, and payments tied to accelerated transition. The auction could assign new flexible use licenses, but only a coordinated program could make those authorizations usable. A winning bidder cannot transmit through an incumbent's functioning system as if the history of the band were erased at settlement. The most expensive spectrum can remain commercially inert until engineers and operators complete the move. Here is the strongest case against the auction model. Spectrum is a public resource. When access goes primarily to the highest bidder, companies with the deepest capital can accumulate the strongest portfolios. High license costs can raise barriers to entry, encourage consolidation, and divert money that might otherwise build networks. A treasury receipt does not prove that rural communities received service, that prices fell, or that competition improved. If policymakers begin treating auction revenue as the score, bans may be cleared because they are lucrative rather than because the change best serves communications needs. The language of selling the sky can become a warning. Public coordination has been reduced to financial extraction.
If the check is enormous, but the dead zone stays dead, the cat would like to inspect the definition of success.
That criticism lands. Revenue is not coverage, competition, or public safety, but the strongest rebuttal begins by refusing to romanticize what auctions replaced. Comparative hearings gave officials difficult judgments among competing promises and created incentives to litigate. Lotteries could award scarce authorizations without testing which applicant placed the highest value on immediate use. Both systems invited strategic behavior of their own. An auction at least makes the selection rule visible and can move licenses toward qualified parties willing to risk capital on them. The public interest question then shifts into the design. Who may bid, what credits apply, how much spectrum one firm may hold, what must be built, when service must begin, and what happens if the winner fails. That last question matters. Defaults can delay service and force the agency to recover or re-auction licenses. Warehousing concerns arise when valuable authorizations remain idle. Performance benchmarks give regulators a point at which promises meet evidence. The rebuttal is credible only if the government is willing to inspect the network after celebrating the sale.
The case for auctions is better than a courtroom, better than a raffle, and it only works if the seller audits the buyer after being paid. Famously common behavior.
The FCC has used bidding credits, eligibility restrictions, reserve prices, spectrum aggregation policies, construction benchmarks, performance requirements, and other tools to pursue goals beyond receipts. None is magic. A bidding credit can broaden participation or invite gaming. A spectrum screen can identify concentration concerns without automatically resolving them. A build-out condition can push deployment but still miss roads, homes, or tribal lands that are costly to serve. Good auction policy, therefore, cannot end when the price clock stops. It has to inspect ownership, construction, service, interference outcomes, and whether the promised competitive opportunities survive contact with financing and infrastructure. Competition analysis must also consider the rest of a company's holdings. 10 megahertz added to a thin portfolio may change a regional operator's future. The same block added to a dominant low-band position may raise different concerns. Band quality, geographic overlap, and market structure make a simple license count almost useless. Concentration lives in the portfolio, not the trophy case. The deeper rebuttal is that auctions are a tool, not a theology. Unlicensed access can outperform exclusive licensing when open equipment markets and contention rules create wider innovation. Shared access may extract more use from a band whose incumbents cannot be displaced everywhere. Administrative assignment remains necessary for missions and services that do not fit an auction. Even within exclusive licensing, the highest bid is only useful if the authorization supports deployment and public objectives. The mature position is neither market-solved spectrum nor markets corrupted it. Congress and the FCC built a market-shaped instrument inside a public regulatory framework, and every band still has to justify whether that instrument fits. Auction totals attract headlines because the number is easy to print. The larger economic effect is harder to fit in one line. A usable license can support investment in radio access networks, semiconductors, devices, software, construction, mapping, transportation, media, and services built on reliable connectivity. The license does not create those businesses by itself. It supplies one coordinated input they need. Unlicensed bands produce their own immense ecosystems without individual auction payments, which is why proceeds alone cannot measure spectrum value. The revealing comparison is not paid means valuable, free means worthless. It is how different rule systems turn limited frequencies into functioning services with tolerable interference. Public safety communications add another measure that no auction total captures cleanly. Coverage, resilience, priority, roaming, and interoperability can matter more than consumer revenue during a disaster. Spectrum policy earns its legitimacy in those moments when a network carries the call that cannot wait for ordinary market conditions. In rural areas, the geometry can fight the business case. Low population density means fewer subscribers share the cost of towers, backhaul, power, and maintenance. A broad low-band license helps coverage, but it does not erase distance or operating expense. Policymakers can combine auction conditions with subsidies, coverage obligations, tribal engagement, or targeted programs. Yet each mechanism solves a different part of the problem. The winning bid answers who receives the authorization. It does not answer whether a road, ranch, reservation, or emergency route will receive dependable service. That answer appears later, tower by tower, in construction reports and on the phones of people who live there. Tribal lands can expose the gap with particular force. A nationwide portfolio may look complete, while communities inside its outline remain underserved. Consultation, consent for sites, terrain, backhaul, power, and local priorities determine whether a coverage polygon becomes an actual connection. The map can be full while the experience is empty.
The certificate says winner. The phone says no service. I know which one the customer is going to believe.
Today, a mobile operator's spectrum portfolio is engineered as deliberately as its physical network. Low bands provide reach. Mid bands carry much of the capacity versus coverage burden. Higher bands add concentrated bandwidth where density or use cases justify them. Dynamic sharing, carrier aggregation, multiple input, multiple output antennas, and more capable radios can extract additional performance, but none abolishes interference or propagation. A carrier that paid heavily for a band still needs devices that support it, sites that can use it, and enough contiguous bandwidth to justify the deployment. The asset lives simultaneously in an FCC database, a balance sheet, a band plan, and the RF conditions outside. This is where the auction story meets the work I do. A dollar figure cannot tell you whether two systems will coexist. Spectrum professionals still have to read allocations, assignments, emission characteristics, receiver performance, locations, schedules, and protection criteria. We coordinate incumbents, we examine proposed operations, we translate rules into technical conditions that hardware can survive. When those layers are wrong, a license may be legally impressive and operationally unusable. When they line up, a frequency assignment that looks like one database row can support communications across an entire mission or market. The market prices access only after engineering and regulation make access legible. That distinction becomes critical during a transition. The incoming operator sees a deployment date. The incumbent sees a mission that must remain available. A defensible plan names equipment, sites, protection thresholds, test procedures, milestones, and responsible parties. Cleared is not a color change on a slide. It is a verified condition in the field.
Nothing in nature turns green faster than a status slide with a deployment date breathing down its neck.
Remember the number reflected in the bidder's glasses. By itself, it meant almost nothing. Its value depended on boundaries the FCC could enforce, devices manufacturers would build, capital a company could raise, sites communities would permit, and signals engineers could keep from colliding. Decades later, the number reappears as millions of ordinary moments: a call from a highway, a card reader at a storefront, a dispatch message, a weather warning, a video from a grandchild. Not every auction promise becomes that network, and not every network requires an auctioned license. But when the chain holds, an invisible authorization becomes infrastructure people stop noticing precisely because it works. That same sale is still happening. SpaceX agreed to pay about $20 billion in cash and stock for EchoStar Spectrum. Spectrum licenses moved to a trust in May 2026. Final transfer to SpaceX remains targeted for November 2027. On July 22nd, the FCC adopted rules to auction another 160 megahertz of upper C-band, with bidding completed and licenses granted by July 4th, 2027. The 1994 auction never really ended. It keeps happening, one band at a time.
Billions of dollars, decades of paperwork, entire careers. So a grandparent can watch a toddler video and feel nothing but the toddler. Honestly, correct outcome.
Look up. There is no fence around 700 megahertz, no painted boundary where one market ends and another begins. The sky carries no receipt. We supplied the borders, the protections, the deadlines, and the bids because billions of devices cannot negotiate with one another by accident. That makes spectrum licenses powerful, valuable, and temporary. A government can authorize access. A company can finance a network around it. An engineer can make the link work. But nobody gets to own the field after the transmitter goes dark. The most expensive real estate on Earth leaves no footprint, and every claim to it lasts only as long as the rules, the hardware, and the public purpose can still hold the air together.
Sold to the highest bidder. Terms, conditions, physics, neighbors, and one extremely judgmental cat included. Please review the interference clause before opening the tuna, and keep your paws inside the authorized service area at all times.
From smoke to signal, every signal has a story. The sky over Washington looks exactly as it did in 1994. Free, open, unpriced. Now you know the ledger hiding inside it, the licenses, the deadlines, the interference rights that turn thin air into working infrastructure. If this is your kind of story, subscribe and follow the series. Want early releases and members-only extras? The Smoke Signal Society link is below. Professional spectrum or regulatory help. There's a separate link for that too. And next time, we go back to a dead frog's leg, twitching on a lab table in Bologna. And the fight, it started between two scientists who could not agree where the electricity was actually coming from. Neither man had the whole answer. Their argument built the first battery.
Every signal in history started with someone who refused to take impossible for an answer. We're chasing that thread, spark by spark. Subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.